June 27th, 2026, 11:18 p.m. 1 ship, 2 drones, 90 minutes to intercept. The entire fuel supply chain for Russia's occupied Crimea garrison riding on a single maritime strike window. This is the story of how Ukraine's naval intelligence operators hunted a ghost tanker through the Black Sea, planned a strike with surgical precision and a sniper's patience, and in under 4 minutes cut Russia's most critical remaining fuel artery to the peninsula. The Kremlin had spent months quietly building this logistics workaround. Ukrainian GUR took it apart in a single night. I'm your host at Steelfront, where we analyze the battles that change wars. What you're about to hear isn't just a naval strike story. It's the story of how a nation without a traditional surface fleet rewrote the rules of maritime warfare, and how that rewrite left a 244-meter tanker listing in the Black Sea, trailing a 4-kilometer fuel slick visible from orbit. By the time this video ends, you'll understand why this single strike caused civilian gasoline rationing in Crimea within 24 hours. And you'll understand what that means for the rest of the war. Stay with me, because the next 30 minutes will show you that the most consequential battles of this war are no longer being fought in trenches. The strategic backdrop begins in late 2025. Ukrainian long-range strike operations had methodically degraded Russia's overland fuel pipeline infrastructure serving Crimea. The Kerch Bridge, already structurally compromised from earlier Ukrainian strikes, had seen its rail freight capacity reduced dramatically. Russian military logistics planners, facing a peninsular garrison that consumed enormous quantities of diesel, aviation fuel, and motor vehicle fuel, needed an alternative. They found it in the Shadow Fleet. This wasn't a novel concept. Russia had been operating sanctioned oil tankers since the first waves of Western energy restrictions, but applying that playbook to military resupply, using falsified AIS transponder data, third-country flag registrations, and rotating vessel identities, was a deliberate escalation. The tankers weren't carrying crude oil for export. They were carrying refined military-grade fuel directly to Crimean port facilities. Ukrainian GUR maritime intelligence had been watching this pattern develop since October 2025. What first appeared to be routine commercial shipping anomalies, vessels with inconsistent draft readings, routes that looped unnecessarily through Georgian and Turkish territorial waters before turning northwest, AIS signals that flickered off and reappeared with different coordinates, gradually resolved into a recognizable pattern, a shadow resupply corridor hidden in plain sight among the Black Sea's commercial traffic. The specific vessel that became the target of the June 27th strike had been designated internally by Ukrainian analysts as Target 7, a 244-meter product tanker flagged through a shell company incorporated in the Marshall Islands, with a beneficial ownership chain that traced, through 4 layers of holding companies, back to a Russian state energy intermediary. The vessel had made 7 confirmed supply runs since March 2026. 7 runs. 0 incidents. The Russian logistics planners almost certainly believed they had found something that worked. They were wrong. Which weapon ultimately severed Russia's Crimea fuel line? Satellite intelligence, naval drone technology, or coordinated GUR planning? We'll break down all 3. Comment below which you think was the decisive factor. A, the satellite tracking network, B, the Magura V5 drone, or C, the operational planning cycle. The answer is more complicated than you might expect. Ukrainian commercial satellite imagery analysis, cross-referenced with Kyiv's access to allied partner intelligence feeds, had been building a predictive transit model for Target 7 since April 2026. The tanker's operators varied departure times, adjusted speeds, and occasionally inserted false waypoints into their AIS transmissions. But physical reality is harder to fake than a digital signal. Draft readings at departure ports, fuel purchase records traceable through commodity market data, and the simple physics of a 244-meter vessel's fuel consumption over known distances all fed into the GUR's analytical model. By late May 2026, Ukrainian maritime intelligence had established a probability envelope for the tanker's transit route with enough confidence to begin operational planning. The critical constraint was time. Target 7's route through the Black Sea kept it within practical Ukrainian maritime strike range for approximately 90 minutes per run, a window defined by the operational range of the Magura V5 naval drone, sea state limitations on drone guidance stability, and the response time of Russian Coast Guard patrol vessels along the transit corridor. 90 minutes. One intercept window per run. The Magura V5 is not a simple weapon. Ukrainian engineers developed this naval surface drone through iterative combat testing stretching back to 2023, and by mid-2026 the platform had become significantly more capable than its original configuration. At roughly 5 meters in length, the Magura V5 runs at near waterline height to avoid radar detection, presenting a minimal cross-section to ship-mounted radar systems designed to detect larger threats. Its electric propulsion system generates a thermal signature so low that thermal imaging calibrated for conventional small craft routinely fails to acquire it. The warhead configuration used in the June 27th strike had been specifically engineered for anti-shipping operations against large commercial-class vessels. Standard anti-ship munitions designed for fast attack craft don't reliably disable a 244-meter tanker with a single hit. The sheer volume of the vessel's compartmentalized hull absorbs and distributes blast damage in ways that smaller ships cannot. Ukrainian weapons engineers solved this with a shaped charge configuration designed to direct blast energy inward and downward through the hull plating, targeting the engineering spaces and fuel cargo compartments amidships. 2 drones, 2 warheads, 1 target. The intercept package required a control infrastructure that hadn't existed 12 months earlier. Satellite relay guidance, routing the drone operator's control signals through a commercial satellite constellation rather than a direct line-of-sight radio link, extended the practical control range far beyond what previous Ukrainian naval drone operations had achieved. The operators were positioned at a surface control station well inside Ukrainian-controlled territory. They were, in the most literal sense, conducting a naval strike from a building on dry land. Here's where the planning nearly came apart. 3 days before the June 27th strike window, Ukrainian satellite tracking indicated that Target 7 had altered its departure schedule. The tanker had been at anchorage outside a Turkish port for 48 hours longer than the predictive model projected. 2 possibilities. Either the vessel's operators had detected surveillance and were varying their pattern, or there was a routine cargo or crew delay. The distinction mattered enormously. If Russian logistics planners had developed counter-surveillance awareness, the intercept window might be a trap, with Russian naval units pre-positioned along the transit route to destroy the drones before they reached the target. GUR maritime planners had to make a call with incomplete information. They ran the satellite data against known Russian naval patrol patterns, cross-referenced with intercepted naval communication traffic, and concluded, not with certainty, but with enough confidence, that the delay was logistical, not tactical. The operation would proceed. One detail that stuck with me going through the open-source record of this strike: the decision to proceed despite that uncertainty required sign-off from senior GUR leadership. This wasn't a field commander's call. The potential strategic value, disrupting Crimea's fuel supply at exactly the moment when Russian garrison reserves were already under pressure from months of attrition, justified the risk. But someone at a desk in Kyiv had to look at ambiguous data and make a binary choice. They chose to proceed. On the night of June 26, 2026, Target 7 departed anchorage and set course northwest through the Black Sea. Ukrainian satellite tracking confirmed the vessel's route matched the high-probability corridor the GUR's model had predicted. Course, speed, and estimated time of entry into the intercept window all fell within projected parameters. The operational team at the surface control station went to full readiness. 2 Magura V5 drones were positioned at their launch point, warheads armed, satellite relay links tested and confirmed active. At approximately 10:45 p.m., Ukrainian tracking systems confirmed Target 7 had entered the intercept window. The tanker was running at standard transit speed, roughly 14 knots, with all navigation lights active and AIS transmitting a standard position signal. To any observer, it was a commercial vessel making a routine crossing. The deceit was architectural, built into the ownership structure, the flag registration, and the cargo documentation, not into the vessel's visible behavior. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 18 minutes changes the entire calculus of Russia's Crimea supply chain. The 2 Magura V5 drones launched at 11:04 p.m. Operating in a coordinated but independently navigated profile, the The drones separated to approach the target from slightly different bearings, a tactical choice designed to complicate any last-minute evasive maneuvering. At 21 knots, the Magura V5 covers water faster than most observers expect from an electric propulsion platform. The distance to intercept was calculated. At the surface control station, operators were watching through drone-mounted cameras with low-light imaging. Target 7's silhouette was unmistakable. The long, low profile of a fully laden product tanker, its hull deep in the water with cargo weight, navigation lights marking bow and stern. The vessel's crew, presumably 15 to 25 people, based on typical manning levels for vessels of this type, had no indication that two weapons were closing on them from the dark surface of the Black Sea. How many vessels did Russia ultimately pull from Black Sea Shadow Fleet operations following this strike? Was it A, 12 tankers, B, all Shadow Fleet traffic for 6 days, or C, a single replacement vessel that continued the route? Hold that question. We'll answer it at the end of this video. At 11:18 p.m., the first Magura V5 struck target 7 amidships on the vessel's port side. The shaped charge warhead detonated with precisely the effect Ukrainian weapons engineers had designed for, a concentrated blast that punched through the hull plating and ignited cargo in the amidships fuel compartment. 4 seconds later, 4 seconds, because the operator of the second drone had held back fractionally to avoid losing guidance lock in the first explosion's electromagnetic interference. The second drone struck approximately 12 meters aft of the first impact point. The combined effect was catastrophic to the vessel's structural integrity and cargo containment. Satellite imagery captured in the hours following the strike, and later released through open-source monitoring organizations, showed Target 7 listing approximately 8 to 12 degrees to port, with a visible oil slick extending roughly 4 kilometers behind and to the northwest of the vessel's stopped position. A Russian Coast Guard vessel reached the tanker within approximately 40 minutes and began a towing operation, but the damage was severe enough that the tow moved slowly, extending the time during which the fuel slick spread. The crew. What about the crew? Ukrainian GUR's public statements on the strike carefully avoided addressing crew casualties directly, and that restraint reflects both the legal complexity of maritime warfare law and the genuine uncertainty of the situation. The tanker was operating in support of a military resupply mission for an occupying force. It was, under the laws of armed conflict, a legitimate military target regardless of its commercial flagging. The crew's status is legally ambiguous. Open source reports in the days following the strike indicated that the Russian Coast Guard towing operations successfully evacuated all or most of the crew, but this has not been independently confirmed. Here's the take that'll generate some debate. Russia's decision to use civilian-flagged commercial vessels for military resupply isn't just a logistics workaround. It's a deliberate strategy of hiding military targets behind civilian cover, placing civilian mariners in harm's way and counting on the international community's reluctance to engage such targets to provide effective protection. Ukraine's decision to strike anyway, based on confirmed intelligence of the vessel's military supply mission, was legally defensible. But the broader pattern, Russia systematically exploiting civilian maritime infrastructure for military purposes, deserves more international scrutiny than it has received. What this entire Shadow Fleet operation reveals about Russian strategic thinking by mid-2026 is telling. The Kremlin was no longer capable of openly supplying its occupied territory through conventional military logistics. The degradation of pipeline infrastructure, the structural damage to the Kerch Bridge rail corridor, and the persistent Ukrainian strike threat to overt military supply lines had forced Russia into a shadow logistics network that depended entirely on concealment to function. Once that concealment was penetrated, once Ukrainian intelligence understood the pattern well enough to predict specific transit windows, the entire network was exposed. Subscribe to Steelfront if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because the doctrine being written in the Black Sea right now will be studied in every naval war college on Earth for the next 50 years. In the 6 days following the June 27th strike, Russian maritime authorities issued what open-source reporting described as temporary safety restrictions on commercial vessel transit through the eastern Black Sea shipping lanes. Every Shadow Fleet tanker rotating through the Crimea resupply corridor stopped moving. 6 days, 0 resupply runs. the immediate operational effect on Crimea's garrison was severe and measurable. Ukrainian GUR analysts, working from satellite imagery of Crimean fuel storage facilities, vehicle movement patterns, and open-source economic reporting from the peninsula, assessed that the disruption cut garrison fuel reserves by an estimated 35% within 2 weeks. That's not a marginal reduction. For a military garrison maintaining armored vehicle readiness, aviation operations, and mechanized unit fuel stocks, a 35% reserve reduction creates genuine operational constraints within weeks. The civilian indicator was perhaps the most telling. Within 24 hours of the strike, open-source reporting from Crimea, drawn from local social media, Russian-language telegram channels with sources on the peninsula, and commercial fuel pricing data, confirmed that civilian gasoline sales had been suspended at multiple locations. The military garrison's fuel priority had been enforced at the expense of civilian availability. When fuel is truly scarce, military requirements crowd out civilian access. That's a straightforward wartime rationing signal. Residents of occupied Crimea, many of whom had lived for over 2 years under a Russian military administration that routinely prioritized garrison needs over civilian welfare, were now directly experiencing the consequences of their occupation's logistical vulnerability. The suspension of civilian fuel sales was both a practical necessity and a political signal, a sign that the Russian military administration could no longer guarantee even basic supply stability. Here's the second layer of this story that most analysis missed entirely. The June 27th strike wasn't just about one tanker. It was about the credibility of the entire Shadow Fleet architecture as a logistical solution. The Kremlin had invested months building this workaround, establishing shell company ownership chains, negotiating with intermediary state actors for flag registrations, routing vessels through jurisdictions with limited maritime enforcement capacity, and calibrating AIS manipulation to stay just below the threshold that triggers international maritime investigation. All of that investment, all of that operational security effort rested on a single assumption: that Ukrainian maritime intelligence couldn't develop the tracking capability to reliably predict transit windows. That assumption was gone. If you believe that logistics wins wars, and every serious military historian does, comment Steelfront below. Because what Ukraine demonstrated in the Black Sea is that logistics interdiction doesn't require a surface fleet. It requires intelligence, precision, and the willingness to build entirely new tools for an entirely new kind of maritime warfare. Russian naval planners faced a stark choice after the strike. Option 1. Resume shadow fleet operations with enhanced counter-surveillance measures, varying routes more aggressively, adding decoy vessels, integrating electronic countermeasures to detect and confuse satellite tracking. Option 2. Find an alternative resupply mechanism for Crimea. Neither option was quickly available. The counter-surveillance upgrades that might make option 1 viable required months of implementation. And any other supply route capable of moving the volumes of refined fuel that Crimea's garrison required simply didn't exist at the necessary scale within the time frame. The 6-day pause in Shadow Fleet operations stretched into a broader operational reshuffling. Ukrainian GUR monitoring of commercial satellite data indicated that Russian logistics planners were attempting to reconfigure the supply schedule, extending intervals between runs, increasing cargo volumes per run to reduce transit frequency, and evaluating whether smaller, faster vessels might present a less trackable profile than the large product tankers that had been the backbone of the resupply network. Each of these adaptations carried costs. Longer intervals between resupply runs meant lower reserve levels at Crimean storage facilities, reducing the operational buffer that garrison commanders depended on for mission planning. Larger cargo volumes per run meant bigger targets with higher value per strike, actually worsening the strategic risk per maritime transit. And smaller, faster vessels, while potentially harder to track, simply couldn't move fuel in the volumes required by a garrison-scale military operation. Put yourself in the position of the Russian logistics officer trying to solve this problem. You're responsible for keeping fuel flowing to a garrison that includes mechanized infantry, artillery units, air defense systems, and supporting aviation assets. Your primary supply route, the pipeline corridor, has been degraded by Ukrainian strikes. Your secondary route, Kerch Bridge rail freight, is operating at reduced capacity. And now your tertiary route, The Shadow Fleet maritime corridor has just been demonstrated to be trackable and strikeable by Ukrainian forces with a weapon system that costs a fraction of the cargo value it destroys. There's no good option on that table. What would you have done differently? If you were commanding NATO's maritime interdiction capability in the Black Sea, what alternative approaches would you have used to achieve the same strategic effect? Comment your analysis. We read every serious tactical breakdown this community produces. The Magura V5 drone's economics deserve explicit attention here because they represent something genuinely new in the cost calculus of naval warfare. A 244-meter product tanker laden with refined military fuel represents an asset value, vessel plus cargo, that Ukrainian analysts estimated in the range of $40 to $60 million. The two Magura V5 drones used in the strike cost, in aggregate, roughly $300,000 to $400,000, including the specialized shaped charge warheads. The return on investment, measured in damage inflicted per dollar of Ukrainian military expenditure, is extraordinary even by the already extreme standards set by FPV drone economics on the land front. This is the warfare mathematics Steelfront has been tracking since our first analysis of Ukrainian naval drone operations. A $500 FPV drone destroying a $3 million Russian tank is a dramatic enough ratio to change ground warfare doctrine. Two naval drones costing a total of $400,000, destroying or disabling a $60 million maritime asset, is a ratio that should restructure how every naval power on Earth thinks about surface ship vulnerability. Real tactics, real consequences. Steelfront. The broader implications for Russian Black Sea Fleet operations extend well beyond the Shadow Fleet logistics problem. Every major surface asset that Russia has attempted to operate in the western and central Black Sea since 2022 has faced Ukrainian maritime drone threat. The flagship Moskva was the first significant loss. A succession of landing craft, corvettes, and support vessels followed. By mid-2026, Russian naval surface operations in the Black Sea had been essentially confined to areas where shore-based air defense coverage could provide at least partial protection against drone attack. And even those areas had proven less safe than Russian planners hoped. The June 27th tanker strike demonstrated that Ukrainian maritime drone capability could now engage targets at distances that pushed the operational boundary of what Russian anti-drone defenses could reliably cover. The satellite relay guidance system that allowed operators to control the Magura V5 drones from a station well inside Ukrainian territory eliminated the previous range constraint that had bounded Ukrainian naval drone operations. As long as satellite relay connectivity was maintained, the drone's operational range became a function of fuel capacity, not control link distance. This is a fundamental change. Think about what that means for the future operational picture. Russian naval planners can no longer calculate a safe distance from Ukrainian maritime drone threat based on previous direct control link range limitations. Any vessel, anywhere in the Black Sea, operating in support of Russian military objectives is now within theoretical reach of Ukrainian naval drones, provided Ukrainian intelligence can identify and track the target long enough to plan an intercept. The Shadow Fleet tanker was identified, it was tracked, it was struck. And Russia has no straightforward answer to the intelligence architecture that made that possible. I've spent considerable time going through the satellite imagery analysis published by open-source monitoring organizations in the weeks following the strike, and one detail kept pulling my attention back. The fuel slick visible in post-strike satellite imagery was elongated in a specific direction, tracking northeast, away from the vessel's stopped position. That orientation is consistent with the prevailing surface current patterns in that section of the Black Sea during late June. What it indicates is that the fuel release from the damaged cargo compartments was continuous and substantial over a period of hours, not a single instantaneous release. The vessel was still losing cargo fuel when the Coast Guard tow finally got underway. That detail matters tactically. It confirms that the shaped charge warheads penetrated the cargo compartment containment rather than simply damaging external hull structure. The weapon performed as designed. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface until you think through the Russian decision-making calculus. The Kremlin had almost certainly assessed Ukrainian naval drone capability as a significant threat to Shadow Fleet operations before the June 27th strike. Russian military intelligence isn't blind to Ukrainian weapons development. They knew the Magura V5 existed. They knew Ukraine had demonstrated willingness and capability to strike Black Sea targets with naval drones, and yet they continued operating the Shadow Fleet resupply corridor on a schedule predictable enough for Ukrainian intelligence to model. Why? The most plausible explanation is that Russian logistics planners assessed the probability of successful Ukrainian interception as low enough to accept the risk. The Shadow Fleet tankers had made 7 runs without incident. The AIS falsification and flag manipulation had successfully obscured ownership. And perhaps most importantly, there was no alternative. Crimea's garrison needed fuel, and the Shadow Fleet was the only logistical mechanism available at the required scale. Risk acceptance driven by operational necessity. The kind of decision that looks rational until the strike happens, and then looks catastrophically wrong in hindsight. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. And by June 2026, satellite relay-guided naval drone strikes against Shadow Fleet logistics represented perhaps the most significant evolution in Ukrainian maritime capability since the first Magura V5 operations in 2023. The weapon itself had improved. The guidance architecture had expanded its range. The intelligence infrastructure tracking Shadow Fleet movements had matured into something sophisticated enough to predict transit windows with operational confidence. All 3 of those development threads converged on the night of June 27th. Target 7 sailed into the intercept window at 11:04 p.m. By 11:18 p.m., the mission was complete. The downstream consequences continued unfolding through July 2026. Ukrainian GUR monitoring reported that Russian logistics planners had begun evaluating alternative fuel storage strategies for Crimea, including dispersed storage at multiple smaller facilities rather than the centralized depot model that had characterized Crimean garrison fuel management. Dispersed storage is harder to monitor and harder to strike, but it also significantly increases the logistical overhead of garrison fuel management and reduces the efficiency of distribution to operational units. Every adaptation costs something. The civilian population of occupied Crimea continued experiencing the downstream effects. Open-source economic monitoring through July indicated that civilian fuel rationing remained in effect at varying intensity across the peninsula, with local authorities citing logistics adjustments in public statements that carefully avoided any mention of the June 27th strike. The Russian administrative apparatus in occupied Crimea was not eager to publicize the fact that a Ukrainian naval operation had disrupted civilian fuel supplies. But the empty fuel stations communicated the reality more effectively than any official statement. The intercepted Russian communications that Ukrainian GUR released through authorized channels in the weeks following the strike painted a picture of genuine operational disruption at the garrison level. Unit commanders requesting resupply authorizations received responses citing temporary logistical constraints. Fuel allocation ratios for mechanized units were reduced. Aviation sortie rates at Crimean bases dropped noticeably in satellite monitoring data. The effects of a 35% fuel reserve reduction were working through the garrison's operational capacity in real time. This is what maritime logistics interdiction looks like when it works. Not a dramatic single-moment collapse, but slow, accumulating pressure on every system that depends on the interdicted supply. Vehicles that can't move as often. Aircraft that fly fewer sorties. Generators running on reduced schedules. A garrison that is still functional, but increasingly constrained. Increasingly aware that the logistical foundation it depends on is no longer reliable. Will Russia find a new Shadow Fleet solution that's harder for Ukrainian intelligence to track? Will Crimea's garrison find ways to reduce fuel consumption enough to sustain operations on reduced resupply volumes? Comment why yes or no on whether you think Russia can restore reliable maritime fuel supply to Crimea within the next 6 months. We'll revisit this question in our next maritime analysis. The lessons of the June 27th strike operate at multiple levels. At the tactical level, the operation demonstrated that satellite relay guidance has effectively eliminated the previous range constraints on Ukrainian naval drone operations. Any future analysis of Ukrainian maritime strike capability must incorporate this reality. The Magura V5's operational range is no longer bounded by direct control link distance. It is bounded only by the drone's physical fuel capacity and the availability of satellite relay infrastructure. both of which Ukrainian engineers and planners have demonstrated the capability to extend. At the operational level, the strike demonstrated the vulnerability of logistics networks that depend on concealment rather than protection. The Shadow Fleet's operational security rested on the assumption that Ukrainian intelligence couldn't develop the analytical capability to reliably predict transit windows. Once that assumption proved wrong, the entire network's risk calculus changed. Any logistics system, maritime, ground, or air, that relies primarily on concealment for protection is vulnerable to an adversary who develops the intelligence capability to penetrate that concealment. At the strategic level, the strike was one episode in a broader Ukrainian campaign to systematically degrade every logistical pathway sustaining Russia's occupation of Crimea. Pipeline infrastructure strikes, Kerch Bridge structural damage, Shadow Fleet interdiction. Each campaign thread adds pressure. None of them individually collapses the garrison's logistics, but cumulatively, they create a situation where Russian military planners are expending enormous energy and resources maintaining supply flows that should, in a conventional logistics environment, be routine. Here's the answer to our quiz question from earlier in the video. How did Russia respond to the June 27th tanker strike? The answer is B. Russia halted all Shadow Fleet tanker movement in the Black Sea for 6 days following the strike. Not just the vessel type that was hit. All Shadow Fleet traffic. The operational pause was total, reflecting how seriously the strike had shaken Russian confidence in the entire maritime resupply architecture. Individual vessels weren't assessed as higher or lower risk. The entire corridor was shut down while Russian logistics planners attempted to understand what Ukrainian intelligence capabilities had made possible and what countermeasures, if any, were available. The answer tells you everything about how seriously Russian military planners took the demonstration. You don't halt your entire alternative logistics network for 6 days because one tanker got unlucky. You halt it because you've just learned that your adversary can find and strike your tankers, and you don't yet know how to stop them. Was a 90-minute intercept window narrow enough to justify the operational risk of proceeding despite the pre-strike uncertainty about Target 7's delayed departure? That's not a rhetorical question. Genuine tactical analysts disagree. Some argue that the uncertainty about whether Russian counter-surveillance had detected the tracking operation warranted delaying until a subsequent transit run, when additional intelligence could either confirm or deny Russian awareness. Others argue that the operational moment, a Crimean garrison already under logistics pressure from months of attrition, made the strike's strategic value high enough to justify accepting the additional uncertainty. Could Russian naval planners have designed a Shadow Fleet logistics system genuinely resistant to the satellite tracking and predictive modeling that Ukrainian GUR employed? Probably, with significantly more operational security discipline, greater route variation, shorter transit frequencies with smaller cargo volumes, and more aggressive counter-surveillance measures. The fact that they didn't suggests either an underestimation of Ukrainian intelligence capability or, more concerning for Russian military effectiveness, an institutional inability to implement the operational security discipline that would have been required. What would you have done differently if you were commanding the Ukrainian maritime drone strike operation? Would you have proceeded on the night of June 27th, despite the pre-strike uncertainty about Target 7's delayed departure? Or would you have waited for a subsequent transit window with cleaner intelligence? The Black Sea is quiet tonight, but the wreck of Target 7, still listing in its last charted position, and the 4-kilometer fuel slick that satellite imagery captured in the hours after the strike tell a story that no amount of Russian official silence can fully obscure. A 244-meter tanker that made 7 runs without incident didn't survive the 8th, and the fuel that was meant to sustain Russia's Crimean garrison will never reach its destination. Modern warfare punishes logistical overconfidence. It punishes the assumption that concealment is the same as protection. And it punishes the belief that an adversary's intelligence capability will remain static while your logistics vulnerability remains constant. Ukraine's GUR maritime planners understood something that Russian logistics officers apparently did not. In the age of commercial satellite monitoring, open-source intelligence aggregation, and satellite relay drone guidance, there is no such thing as a truly invisible supply line. There is only a supply line that hasn't been found yet. Target 7 had been found. It had been tracked. And on the night of June 27th, 2026, It became the evidence that changes how every military planner on Earth thinks about maritime logistics vulnerability. Subscribe to Steelfront, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The Black Sea is quiet now, but the wreck remains. A silent reminder that modern warfare punishes tactical mistakes without mercy, and that the most effective weapons on Earth aren't always the most expensive ones. Sometimes they're 2 drones and 90 minutes of darkness. Stay vigilant.